The flight was routine. First-class passengers settled in, attendants moved through the aisles, and an elderly veteran quietly took his seat. But then, everything changed. A flight attendant stormed toward him, eyes filled with impatience. She didn't ask questions. She didn't check facts. She just assumed. And then, in front of everyone, she slapped him. The cabin fell silent. Passengers stared in shock. She thought she was disciplining an old man who didn't belong. What she didn't know? The man she had just humiliated owned the skies more than she ever could. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another one. The airport was alive with movement. A steady stream of travelers passing through security lines and scanning departure boards. Among them was an elderly man named Edric Holt, his steps measured, his posture upright with quiet authority. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, his sharp brown eyes reflecting years of wisdom and experience. He carried himself with the kind of presence that commanded respect without demanding it. Dressed in a well-fitted navy suit, he looked like a man accustomed to discipline, his only accessory a small military pin on his lapel, one that spoke of sacrifice, duty, and a past that few could truly understand. As he approached the boarding gate, the attendant, a young woman with a friendly smile, glanced at his ticket. "You're all set, Mr. Holt. Enjoy your flight." She scanned his pass and motioned for him to proceed. He gave a polite nod and stepped forward, moving through the jet bridge with steady confidence. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin was already filling up, passengers settling into their spacious seats, adjusting pillows, and pulling out their devices. Edric moved toward his assigned seat, placing his leather bag into the overhead compartment with ease. As he lowered himself into the plush seat, a moment of stillness passed. A brief pause as he gazed out of the window, his fingers resting lightly on the armrest. He had flown many times before, yet every flight carried an air of familiarity, like stepping into a world where time felt suspended between destinations. The moment was interrupted by a sharp voice. "Sir, I think you are in the wrong section." He turned, his expression unreadable, as he met the gaze of the flight attendant, standing a few feet away. Clarissa Vaughn was tall, blonde, and poised, her uniform pristine, every strand of hair tucked tightly into place. There was no warmth in her eyes, just the cool detachment of someone who had already made up her mind. Edric didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and retrieved his boarding pass, holding it out calmly. Clarissa hesitated before taking it, her eyes scanning over the details. A flicker of confusion crossed her face, but she masked it quickly. She handed the ticket back with a forced smile. "I just wanted to double-check. Mistakes happen, after all." Her tone was laced with the kind of politeness that wasn't meant to be polite at all. Edric remained silent, slipping the pass back into his jacket. He knew the look in her eyes. He had seen it before, long before she was even born. Across the aisle, a businessman named Jonas Clay glanced up from his laptop, watching the exchange with mild curiosity before returning to his work. A woman in a designer dress, Lena Whitmore, flipped through a magazine, deliberately avoiding eye contact, pretending not to have heard. The energy in the cabin shifted, a silent tension lingering even as Clarissa turned on her heel and walked away. Edric leaned back into his seat, his fingers tracing the edge of his armrest. He had been through worse, much worse. This was nothing. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this flight was about to become a moment none of them would forget, and Clarissa Vaughn was about to make the biggest mistake of her career. The last of the first-class passengers settled in, and the overhead compartments clicked shut one by one. Edric adjusted his seatbelt, his gaze drifting out the window as the hum of the engines filled the cabin. The flight crew moved through the aisles, performing last-minute checks before takeoff. The moment should have passed. It should have been nothing more than an uncomfortable exchange, a fleeting misjudgment that would fade as soon as the plane lifted off. But Clarissa Vaughn wasn't finished. She lingered near the galley, watching Edric from the corner of her eye, her thoughts running in circles. Something about the way he had looked at her, calm, unwavering, unshaken, had irritated her. She had worked flights for years, and she knew when someone didn't belong in first class. Mistakes happen, sure, but this didn't feel like one. It felt off. She wasn't about to let an oversight slide. Not on her watch. She turned to one of the junior flight attendants, Meera Patel, a soft-spoken woman with dark hair pulled into a sleek bun. "Did you check the first-class manifest?" Clarissa asked, her voice low but firm. Meera blinked, startled by the question. Well, yes. The passenger lists are always checked before boarding." "Double-check it," Clarissa insisted, her tone leaving no room for argument. Meera hesitated, glancing toward the cabin where Edric sat, then back at Clarissa. "You think his ticket isn't real?" Clarissa folded her arms. "I think he's in the wrong seat. I've seen people try to get into first class before, flashing someone else's boarding pass, hoping they don't get caught. He's dressed well, sure, but I have a feeling about this one." Meera shifted uncomfortably. "He scanned in at the gate with no issue. If there was a problem, they would have flagged it." Clarissa exhaled sharply. "Look, just check. I want to be sure." Meera nodded reluctantly and moved toward the cockpit, where the flight records were stored. Clarissa straightened her uniform and turned back toward the cabin. Edric sat just as he had before, silent, composed, a quiet strength in the way he held himself. He wasn't reading a newspaper or checking his phone like the other passengers. He simply sat, his hands resting on the armrests, his eyes focused ahead as if he were already miles away. She didn't like it. Steeling herself, she walked back into the aisle and stopped beside his seat. "Sir," she said, her voice polite but clipped, "I need to see your ticket again." Edric slowly turned his head, meeting her gaze. His expression didn't change. He didn't look startled or confused, just patient, as if he had been expecting this. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the boarding pass once more, holding it out with the same steady hand. Clarissa took it, scanning the details carefully. Seat 1A, first class. Everything was in order. And yet, the irritation inside her only grew. She forced another tight smile and handed the ticket back. "Thank you. Just making sure." Without another word, she turned and walked away, ignoring the way some of the passengers shifted in their seats, now fully aware that something was going on. Jonas Clay glanced up from his laptop again, exchanging a knowing look with Lena Whitmore, but neither said a word. A few moments later, Meera returned from the cockpit, her expression tense. She leaned in close to Clarissa, lowering her voice. "His name is on the manifest. He belongs in first class." Clarissa's jaw tightened. Meera hesitated. "Maybe we should just let it go. He hasn't done anything wrong." Clarissa exhaled through her nose, the frustration simmering just beneath her skin. She wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone like Meera. "Fine," she muttered, "but if I see anything suspicious, I'm dealing with it." She stepped away, but something in her eyes said she wasn't done. And Edric? He sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. He had known this kind of suspicion before. He had seen it in the eyes of strangers who had no idea who he was. And though he didn't say a word, something inside him told him that this was far from over. The plane taxied toward the runway, the hum of the engines growing stronger as the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming passengers and announcing the expected flight time. Edric adjusted his seatbelt, his movements slow and deliberate. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the airport. It should have been a peaceful moment, a routine flight, nothing more. But Clarissa Vaughn wouldn't let it go. She stood near the galley, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her foot tapping against the floor. Something about this wasn't sitting right with her. She had been working flights long enough to know when something felt out of place, and Edric Holt, sitting there like he belonged, made her feel exactly that, like something was out of place. Meera Patel stood beside her, glancing toward the cabin before lowering her voice. "Clarissa, you saw the manifest. He's supposed to be here." Clarissa barely looked at her. "That doesn't mean it's his ticket." Meera hesitated. "Then whose ticket do you think it is?" Clarissa let out a small scoff. "Come on, Meera. You've seen it before. People using someone else's name, finding a way to slip past security. Maybe he got it from a friend. Maybe someone else booked it for him. Either way, something isn't adding up." Meera frowned. "He's not acting suspicious." Clarissa's lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't going to explain it, not in words at least. It wasn't about anything specific Edric had done. It was just a feeling, a certainty she couldn't shake. The plane picked up speed, rolling faster down the runway before lifting smoothly into the air. The cabin shifted as passengers settled in for the flight, some reclining their seats, others scrolling through their phones. A few minutes passed before the seatbelt sign dinged off, and the attendants began their usual service routine. Clarissa moved through the aisle, her forced smile in place as she handed out drinks and small packets of snacks. She barely paid attention to the passengers as she did it, her mind preoccupied. When she reached Edric's row, she paused just long enough to place a glass of water on his tray table. "Can I get you anything else?" Edric looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "No, thank you." His voice was deep, steady, the kind that held weight even in a whisper. Clarissa lingered for a second too long before nodding stiffly and moving on. A few rows back, Jonas Clay watched the interaction over the rim of his glass. His eyes narrowed slightly. He wasn't the type to involve himself in other people's business, but there was something strange about the way the flight attendant was behaving. He had flown first class more times than he could count, and he knew when something felt off. Lena Whitmore, seated beside him, flipped a page in her magazine. "She's acting weird, isn't she?" she murmured. Jonas took a slow sip of his drink before setting it down. "She's looking for a reason." Lena arched an eyebrow. "A reason for what?" Jonas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward Edric, watching the way the older man sat, calm, collected, but completely aware of everything around him. Jonas had seen men like him before, men who had been through things others couldn't imagine, and for some reason, that made him uneasy. Back at the front of the plane, Clarissa stopped by the service station, pretending to straighten a stack of napkins while her mind raced. She needed something, a reason, something to confirm what she already believed to be true. And then, just as the thought crossed her mind, her eyes landed on Edric's leather bag in the overhead bin above his seat. She knew what she had to do. Without hesitation, she reached for the in-flight phone, dialing the number to the cockpit. A few seconds later, the captain's voice came through. "This is Captain Harrington." Clarissa lowered her voice. "Captain, I have a concern about a passenger in first class." There was a brief pause. "What kind of concern?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I believe there's been a security oversight. I need clearance to inspect a passenger's belongings." On the other end of the line, the captain exhaled. "Clarissa, is there a reason for this?" She straightened her shoulders. "Yes, sir. I believe the passenger in seat 1A may be in possession of a ticket that isn't his." Another pause, then. "And do you have proof of that?" Clarissa's grip tightened on the phone. "Not yet, but I'd rather not wait until we land to find out." Silence stretched between them. Then finally the captain spoke. "Fine, but if there's nothing wrong, I don't want any complaints about unnecessary searches." "Understood," Clarissa said quickly before hanging up. Her pulse quickened as she turned back toward the cabin. She had permission. Now all she had to do was act. Clarissa moved down the aisle with careful, measured steps, her eyes locking onto the overhead bin above Edric Holt's seat. The plane hummed steadily through the sky, passengers lost in their own worlds, unaware of what was about to unfold. She had been waiting for this moment, for the right excuse to prove that something wasn't right about him, and now she had it. Stopping beside his row, she put on her most professional smile, the kind that masked the tension just beneath the surface. "Sir," she said smoothly, folding her hands in front of her, "I need to ask you to step into the aisle for a moment." Edric barely reacted. He lifted his gaze, studying her face with that same unreadable expression. "Is there a problem?" Clarissa kept her tone even. "We're conducting a routine security check of carry-on bags. It won't take long." Edric's eyes flickered with something she couldn't quite place. He exhaled softly, then unbuckled his seatbelt, rising without a word. As he moved into the aisle, she reached up and unlatched the overhead bin, pulling down his worn leather bag. It was nothing special, aged but sturdy, the kind of bag carried by men who valued function over style. Passengers were starting to notice. Jonas Clay lowered his laptop screen slightly, his sharp eyes narrowing. Lena Whitmore stilled in her seat, her magazine forgotten. Across the cabin, Meera Patel stood frozen near the galley, her fingers tightening around the tray she had been carrying. Clarissa placed the bag on Edric's empty seat, her fingers brushing over the smooth leather before pulling at the zipper. But before she could open it, Edric's voice cut through the air, low and firm. "Do you have a warrant for that?" The question sent a ripple through the nearby passengers. Clarissa forced a small chuckle, tilting her head slightly. "Sir, this is an airline security procedure. We're allowed to inspect passenger belongings if we believe there's a security concern." Edric didn't move. "And what exactly is the concern?" Clarissa met his gaze, but there was something about the way he was looking at her that made her uneasy. Like he already knew what she was going to say before she said it. Like he had been through this before. "Just standard protocol," she answered quickly, unzipping the bag before he could protest further. The moment the bag opened, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her. But as she pulled back the flap, expecting to find something, anything that would justify her actions, her breath caught. Inside the bag was nothing but neatly packed clothes, a leather-bound notebook, and a folded newspaper. Nothing out of place, nothing suspicious, nothing that proved her right. Clarissa's fingers curled slightly, gripping the edge of the bag. This didn't make sense. She had been so sure. Edric let the silence stretch before speaking again. "Find what you were looking for?" His tone wasn't mocking. It wasn't angry. It was calm. Too calm. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few exchanged glances, and Jonas Clay let out a slow, knowing exhale. Clarissa straightened, forcing herself to maintain control of the situation. "Just following security measures," she said quickly, zipping the bag shut. She lifted it from the seat and handed it back to Edric. He took it without a word, placing it back into the overhead bin before settling into his seat again. But this time, when he leaned back, there was something different in the way he did it, something that made it clear. He had just let her walk into her own mistake. Clarissa turned abruptly and walked toward the galley, ignoring the heat creeping up her neck. Mira was still standing there, her eyes filled with something between disbelief and disappointment. "You searched his bag?" Mira whispered, keeping her voice low so passengers wouldn't hear. Clarissa huffed. "It was necessary." Mira shook her head. "You didn't find anything. You just embarrassed yourself." Clarissa's jaw tightened. "I don't make mistakes, Mira." But as she turned back toward the cabin, she saw the way passengers were now looking at her differently. A few were whispering, others just watching in silence. She wasn't sure which was worse. And Edric? He sat there as composed as ever, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. She had gone looking for proof that he didn't belong. Instead, she had just proven something else entirely. And the flight was far from over. The tension in the cabin thickened, invisible yet heavy, like a storm that hadn't broken yet. The hum of the engines filled the silence Clarissa Vaughn had left behind, but the damage had already been done. People were watching her now. Passengers who once ignored her were paying attention, whispering, exchanging glances. The energy had shifted, and she could feel it. Clarissa stood stiffly near the galley, gripping the counter with white-knuckled fingers. Her heart pounded beneath the crisp fabric of her uniform. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had expected, no, she had been sure, she would find something, anything that justified her suspicion. But Edric Holt had sat there, unwavering, as she had humiliated herself. Mira Patel placed a cup on the counter beside her, her voice barely above a whisper. "You should stop this." Clarissa's jaw clenched. "There's nothing to stop." Mira exhaled, glancing toward the cabin. "People saw what you did. They know it wasn't just protocol. You singled him out." Clarissa ignored the comment, pretending to adjust the stack of napkins beside her. "Let's just get back to work." Mira didn't argue, but the look in her eyes said everything. Meanwhile, back in his seat, Edric let out a slow breath. His hands rested lightly on the armrests, his face unreadable. He had spent decades learning how to stay calm, how to hold his ground without saying a word. But that didn't mean he hadn't felt the sting of what had just happened. Jonas Clay leaned slightly in his seat, his voice low but steady. "That was unnecessary." Edric turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting Jonas's. Jonas gave a small nod toward the galley. "She's got a problem with you." Edric studied him for a moment before looking away. Not the first time someone's had a problem with me. Jonas tilted his whiskey glass slightly, watching the way the ice shifted inside. Maybe not, but I get the feeling she doesn't know who she's messing with. Edric said nothing. Across the aisle, Lena Whitmore sighed, setting her magazine down. I hate when people like her think they can do whatever they want, she muttered under her breath. Jonas smirked, shaking his head. It's going to be a long flight. Clarissa re-entered the cabin, forcing a composed smile as she began checking on passengers. She kept her movements sharp, professional, but no matter how many drinks she poured or napkins she handed out, she could feel it. People were still looking at her differently. Then, just as she was refilling a passenger's glass, a voice crackled over the intercom. Ms. Vaughn, please report to the cockpit immediately. The glass in her hand trembled slightly. She set the bottle down, inhaled deeply, and forced herself to walk forward, keeping her expression neutral. But inside, something twisted in her stomach. She had never been called to the cockpit mid-flight before, and she had a sinking feeling she knew why. Clarissa's heels clicked against the floor as she walked toward the front of the plane, her back straight, her face carefully composed. But inside, unease crawled beneath her skin. The cockpit door loomed ahead, and she hesitated for just a second before knocking twice. A sharp voice answered almost immediately. Come in. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cockpit was dimly lit, the control panels glowing softly as Captain Harrington, a man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair, turned his seat to face her. Beside him, co-pilot Reed, younger but equally serious, kept his gaze fixed on the controls. Clarissa folded her hands in front of her, forcing a pleasant smile. You needed me, Captain. Harrington didn't return the expression. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. Would you like to tell me why I just received a direct call from ground control regarding a first-class passenger complaint? Clarissa's stomach dropped, but she didn't let it show. I was conducting a security check, she said smoothly. Just standard procedure. The captain's jaw tightened. Is that right? Because according to reports, you specifically targeted Mr. Holt, questioned his right to be in first class, and then searched his belongings in front of other passengers. Clarissa stiffened. I was just following protocol. You mean the same protocol that says bag searches should only be conducted under reasonable suspicion? Harrington's voice was calm, but there was a weight behind it. Tell me, Ms. Vaughn, what exactly did Mr. Holt do to warrant that suspicion? Clarissa opened her mouth but hesitated. What could she say? That she had a feeling? That something about him didn't sit right with her? She knew better than to say those words out loud. Harrington didn't need her to answer. He exhaled sharply and shook his head. Do you even know who that man is? Clarissa frowned. He's just a passenger. The co-pilot let out a quiet chuckle, one that held no amusement. Harrington's eyes narrowed. Clarissa, Mr. Holt is a retired brigadier general, a decorated war veteran, a man who has more flight hours in military aircraft than you'll ever log in this airline. And you just humiliated him in front of a plane full of people. Clarissa's breath caught, her body going rigid. A general? The blood drained from her face. Harrington studied her reaction, then sighed. That's not even the worst part. Her throat tightened. What do you mean? Harrington leaned forward slightly. He didn't report you. Clarissa blinked. He didn't? No, Harrington confirmed. But someone else did, and that complaint went straight to the airline's executive office. Clarissa's chest tightened. Who? Harrington's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. His wife? Silence. Clarissa's heart hammered against her ribs. She licked her lips, trying to keep her voice steady. And why does that matter? Harrington gave a dry chuckle, shaking his head. Because, Ms. Vaughn, his wife isn't just anyone. She's Eleanor Holt, the owner of this airline. The world tilted beneath her feet. Eleanor Holt. The Eleanor Holt. The woman who had built this airline from the ground up. The woman whose signature was on every policy, every decision, every paycheck, including Clarissa's, and she had just disrespected her husband. Clarissa's knees felt weak, but she locked them in place. Captain, I didn't know. No, you didn't, Harrington agreed, his expression darkening. And that's the problem. The radio crackled, a voice from air traffic control requesting a routine update. Harrington ignored it. He leaned in, lowering his voice to something more dangerous. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk back into that cabin and apologize to Mr. Holt. Publicly. Clarissa swallowed hard. Harrington continued. When this flight lands, you will be met by airline security and escorted directly to the executive office. If I were you, I'd start thinking about what you're going to say to Mrs. Holt. Because if I had to guess, your career just hit turbulence. Clarissa's breathing came faster, her palms damp. This wasn't just about a complaint anymore. This was about survival. She had thought she was in control. She had thought she was untouchable, but she had never been more wrong. Clarissa stepped out of the cockpit, her body rigid as she walked back toward the first-class cabin. The weight of what she had just learned pressed down on her like a heavy stone. Eleanor Holt, the name repeated in her head, each syllable louder than the last. How had she not known? How had she not even considered the possibility? The murmurs in the cabin had died down, but the eyes were still there, watching her, waiting. People who had once ignored the situation were now fully aware that something had shifted. They had seen the bag search, the disrespect, and now they were waiting for what would happen next. She reached Edric Holt's row and stopped, forcing herself to take a slow breath. He hadn't moved. He sat in the same relaxed posture, hands resting on the armrests, his gaze fixed out the window as if none of this had touched him. But Clarissa knew better. Her throat felt dry as she finally spoke. Mr. Holt. He turned his head, his face unreadable. Clarissa's voice almost wavered, but she caught it in time. I need to apologize for my behavior earlier. It was unprofessional and She hesitated, hating the words that followed. I was wrong. The cabin was silent. Jonas Clay set his glass down, his expression unreadable. Lena Whitmore arched an eyebrow, tilting her head slightly. Passengers who had stayed quiet before were now paying close attention. Edric remained quiet for a long moment. Then, with measured calm, he asked, Wrong about what? Clarissa blinked. I shouldn't have questioned your seat, or searched your bag. He studied her, the silence stretching uncomfortably. Then his eyes locked onto hers, steady and unwavering. And why did you do it? A flicker of something passed through Clarissa's face. Irritation, discomfort, something unspoken. It was just a misunderstanding. Edric's gaze didn't waver. Misunderstandings happen when someone makes an honest mistake. His voice was quiet, steady, but there was an edge to it. This wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. The words hit harder than Clarissa expected. A few passengers shifted in their seats, exchanging looks. She could feel it, the weight of their judgment, their silent agreement with him. She cleared her throat. I didn't mean... You didn't think, Edric interrupted, his voice still calm, but firmer now. You assumed. Clarissa's pulse pounded in her ears. She was used to being the one in control, the one setting the rules. But right now, in front of all these people, she was the one being held accountable. Jonas Clay exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. Lena crossed her arms, waiting to see what would happen next. Clarissa clenched her jaw, forcing a nod. I understand. I truly apologize. Edric studied her for another long moment before finally looking away. Dismissed. That was worse than if he had yelled at her. Clarissa swallowed and stepped back, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. She had never felt so exposed, so small. Meera Patel was watching from the galley, her lips pressed together. She didn't say anything as Clarissa passed, but the look in her eyes said enough. You did this to yourself. Clarissa wanted to disappear, but the flight wasn't over, and the worst was still ahead. Clarissa hurried back toward the galley, her breath uneven as she stepped out of sight. The cabin remained heavy with tension, but she refused to look back. She could still feel their stares, the weight of their judgment pressing into her back like 1,000 needles. She had lost control of the situation, and everyone knew it. She braced her hands against the counter, her fingers pressing hard into the smooth surface. Her heart was still racing, her mind spinning with what had just happened. She had been forced to apologize to a man she had been so sure didn't belong. A man she had humiliated in front of everyone. A man whose wife owned the very airline that had given her this job, and she had done it all for nothing. Meera Patel stood a few feet away, silently organizing the drink cart. She hadn't said a word since the apology, but Clarissa knew she had seen everything. Meera finally spoke, her voice careful. "That must have been hard for you." Clarissa snapped her head up. "Excuse me?" Meera met her gaze evenly. Apologizing. That must have been hard. Clarissa's jaw clenched. "It was necessary." Meera gave a slow nod. "And yet you couldn't even admit why you really did it." Clarissa stiffened. "Drop it, Meera." Meera exhaled, shaking her head. "You still don't get it, do you?" She gestured toward the first-class cabin. "That man, you thought he didn't belong. And the worst part? Even after everything, I don't think you regret what you did. I think you regret getting caught." Clarissa's chest tightened, but she kept her face blank. "I don't need a lecture from you." Meera didn't push further. She simply turned back to the drink cart, her silence louder than words. Clarissa straightened her uniform, forcing herself to breathe. She just needed to get through this flight. Once they landed, she would find a way to fix this. She always did. But then, just as she turned to check on the passengers, the intercom crackled to life. "This is Captain Harrington. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent shortly. Please remain seated and ensure your seatbelts are fastened." Clarissa swallowed hard. They were landing, which meant she had minutes left before she would have to face Eleanor Holt. Her fingers curled into fists as a cold realization settled over her. This wasn't just about a complaint anymore. This was about her career, and whether it would still exist after today. Clarissa tried to steady her breathing, but the weight of what was about to happen settled deep in her chest. She had made mistakes before, but nothing like this. Nothing that could end everything she had worked for in a single flight. She turned toward the cabin, forcing herself to act normal, but it was impossible to ignore the shift in energy around her. Passengers weren't just watching her anymore. They were waiting to see what would happen when the plane touched the ground. Edric Holt hadn't moved. He remained seated, looking straight ahead, his expression unreadable. If he was angry, he didn't show it. If he wanted revenge, he wasn't the kind of man who would ask for it. And somehow that made it worse. Clarissa had seen plenty of difficult passengers in her career. Angry businessmen who shouted when their meals were cold, wealthy tourists who threw tantrums over last-minute seat changes. But Edric wasn't like them. He didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. He didn't need to demand power. He already had it. And worse than that, his wife had it too. She swallowed hard, turning toward Meera, who was finishing up her final checks. "What happens when we land?" Clarissa asked, keeping her voice low. Meera barely glanced at her. "You know exactly what happens." Clarissa's stomach twisted. "Security," Meera nodded. "They'll be waiting." Clarissa's fingers clenched at her sides. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had always been in control, always the one enforcing the rules, deciding who got treated with respect and who didn't. But now the power had slipped away from her, and there was nothing she could do to take it back. The plane jolted slightly as it descended, the clouds thick outside the windows. The passengers adjusted in their seats, the anticipation of landing filling the air. Some reached for their bags, others checked their watches. But Clarissa felt like time had slowed, trapping her in the final moments before her entire career crashed down around her. She turned away from the cabin, pressing her back against the galley wall, her heart slamming against her ribs. She needed to think. She needed a way out. Maybe if she got ahead of this, if she spoke to Mrs. Holt first, explained that it was all a misunderstanding, maybe she could fix it. But deep down, she already knew the truth. There was no fixing this. She had crossed a line, and she had done it in front of too many people to pretend otherwise. The seatbelt sign dinged, and the intercom crackled to life again. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing." Clarissa inhaled sharply. This was it. She stepped back into the aisle, checking the rows out of habit, but all she could focus on was Edric Holt. He reached down, adjusting the sleeve of his suit. The small military pin on his lapel caught the cabin lights, gleaming for just a second before he straightened. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't even concerned. He had already won, and he hadn't lifted a finger to do it. Clarissa's skin prickled as she turned away. The runway appeared through the windows, the wheels lowering beneath the plane with a dull mechanical hum. The ground was close now, seconds away. Clarissa forced herself to stand tall, schooling her face into a neutral expression. If she was going down, she would do it with dignity. The tires screeched against the pavement, and the plane shuddered as it slowed. Passengers exhaled, stretching, preparing to leave. Clarissa exhaled too, but for her this was only the beginning. The plane slowed as it rolled down the runway, the hum of the engines shifting to a softer, controlled vibration. The usual routine of landing played out, the overhead bins rattling slightly, passengers adjusting in their seats, the muted clatter of seatbelts being unbuckled too soon. But this landing was different. There was no rush to gather bags, no casual conversations about connecting flights. Instead, an unspoken tension filled the air, a lingering awareness of what had happened mid-flight. Clarissa felt it pressing down on her. She stood near the galley, her hands clenched tightly behind her back as the captain made his final announcement over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. The local time is 3:45 p.m. Please remain seated until we reach the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off. On behalf of our crew, thank you for flying with us today. His voice was as steady as ever, but Clarissa could hear something in it that hadn't been there before. A subtle coldness, a quiet disappointment. She wasn't just another flight attendant right now. She was the one the entire crew had been warned about. She risked a glance toward Edric Holt. He was sitting exactly as he had been before, his expression calm, his hands resting lightly on the armrests. But there was something deliberate about the way he remained still, something in the way he waited, like a man who knew he had nothing left to prove. Jonas Clay, still seated across from Edric, exhaled slowly and shut his laptop. You know, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Lena Whitmore to hear. I'd pay good money to watch what happens next. Lena smirked, flipping the page of her magazine without really looking at it. You won't have to pay, just wait. Clarissa's breath was coming quicker now. She needed to move, needed to do something. She had spent her entire career building herself up, making sure she was respected among the flight crew, that passengers knew she was the one in control. She had spent years deciding how people were treated. And now, for the first time, she was on the other side of it. The plane made its final turn toward the gate, and through the narrow window near the galley, Clarissa caught sight of something that made her stomach drop. Airport security. Two uniformed officers stood just beyond the jet bridge, their arms crossed, their expressions unreadable. They weren't there for routine assistance. They were waiting for someone. They were waiting for her. Meera Patel stepped up beside her, her voice barely above a whisper. You might want to prepare yourself. Clarissa forced a tight, thin-lipped smile. I can handle it. Meera didn't return the smile. You sure about that? Clarissa didn't answer. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and the moment it did, passengers moved, but not in the usual chaotic rush. This time, there was something different in the way they stood, the way they stretched, the way they adjusted their belongings. They were still waiting. Edric Holt took his time unbuckling his seatbelt, not rushing, not stalling, just moving at his own pace, completely undisturbed by what was coming. He reached for his leather bag, the same one Clarissa had searched without cause, and lifted it with effortless ease before stepping into the aisle. Jonas Clay leaned back in his seat, giving Clarissa a single glance before shaking his head. You really picked the wrong one to mess with. Clarissa ignored him. She had to keep it together. She forced herself to stand tall, shoulders squared, trying to ignore the rising panic clawing at her throat. She had made it through worse. She had survived difficult situations before. But as the door to the plane opened and the two security officers stepped inside, she realized something. There was no surviving this. One of the officers, a man with a neatly trimmed beard and sharp eyes, stepped forward, his gaze locking onto her with quiet authority. Miss Vaughn? His voice was calm, steady, unhurried. Clarissa's entire body went cold. Yes. The officer didn't move, didn't break eye contact. He didn't have to. His presence alone was enough to silence every conversation in the front rows of the plane. You'll need to come with us. Clarissa's breath hitched. Passengers were staring now. Really staring. Some pretended not to watch. Others leaned just slightly forward, eager to catch every second of what was happening. Mira exhaled softly beside her, shaking her head as if she had already known this was coming. Clarissa licked her lips, trying to keep her voice even. Is there a reason for this? The second officer, a woman with dark hair pulled into a tight ponytail, raised an eyebrow. There have been reports of an incident regarding the mistreatment of a first-class passenger. A formal review has been requested. Clarissa's hands curled into fists at her sides. By whom? A voice answered from behind her, calm and deliberate. By me. Clarissa turned sharply, her stomach twisting as she locked eyes with Edric Holt. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't even angry. He was simply looking at her as if he had expected this moment all along. Clarissa opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself, to say anything that might salvage what was left of her dignity. But before she could, the bearded officer cleared his throat. This way, Miss Vaughn. Clarissa hesitated, but there was no getting out of this. She had spent years walking through airport terminals with confidence, head held high, uniform crisp and respected. But now she was the one being escorted off the plane, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The walk down the jet bridge was the longest of Clarissa Vaughn's life. The low hum of the terminal seeped through the thin walls, distant voices of gate agents and departing passengers filling the space, but she barely heard any of it. The only sound that mattered was the measured footsteps of the security officers flanking her, each step dragging her closer to the unknown. Her mind raced. What exactly was waiting for her? Would she be fired on the spot? Suspended? Would she even be allowed to speak in her defense? She had handled difficult situations before, navigated tense moments with passengers, but this was different. As the jet bridge opened into the terminal, she immediately spotted them. Two airline executives stood a few feet away, their crisp suits marking them as something above her rank. Their expressions were unreadable, but Clarissa knew a verdict had already been made before she even had the chance to speak. And standing just a little behind them, watching everything unfold with quiet intensity, was Eleanor Holt. Clarissa had never met her in person, but she had seen pictures. A woman with power in her posture, intelligence in her sharp gaze, and the unmistakable presence of someone who had built an empire and didn't tolerate nonsense. She wasn't wearing a business suit like the executives. No, she didn't need to prove herself with formalities. She stood in sleek navy slacks and a tailored blouse, the kind of effortless elegance that only came from knowing you owned the very floors people walked on. And she was staring directly at Clarissa. Clarissa's breath hitched, but she forced herself to keep walking. The moment she reached them, one of the executives, a tall man with silver-streaked hair, tilted his head toward the security officers. That'll be all. We'll handle it from here. The officers gave a brief nod and stepped away, but Clarissa didn't feel any relief. Ms. Vaughn, the silver-haired man continued, his voice clipped but controlled. Follow us. Clarissa swallowed hard but didn't argue. The group moved through the terminal, leading her away from the main crowds and toward the private executive lounge, an area of the airport reserved for top-tier airline personnel and VIP guests. She had passed by it before, but she had never entered. Now the glass doors slid open before her, and she stepped into a quiet, dimly lit space filled with polished floors, expensive furniture, and an air of exclusivity that made her feel small. The executives gestured toward a sleek conference room on the right. Inside, a long table stretched across the space, perfectly arranged, as if this moment had been planned well in advance. Clarissa stepped inside hesitantly, the doors sliding shut behind her. The silver-haired executive took a seat at the head of the table, folding his hands together. Sit. Clarissa hesitated for only a second before lowering herself into a chair. Then came the silence. It stretched, suffocating, heavy with expectation. Finally, Eleanor Holt stepped forward, breaking the quiet like a force of nature. You don't know who I am, do you? She asked, her voice smooth but sharp. Clarissa swallowed hard. I do now, ma'am. Eleanor's lips twitched, but it wasn't amusement. It was something colder. You disrespected my husband, she said simply, sitting down across from Clarissa. You humiliated a man who has served his country, who has flown more aircraft than you will ever set foot in. And worse, you did it with full confidence that you were right. Clarissa opened her mouth to defend herself, but Eleanor tilted her head slightly, and that single movement was enough to silence her. "Tell me something, Miss Vaughn," Eleanor continued, her fingers tapping lightly against the table. "When you questioned his ticket, when you searched his bag, when you stood there believing, without a doubt, that he didn't belong, what exactly was it that made you so sure?" Clarissa felt her throat tighten. I was just following procedure." Eleanor's eyes darkened. "Don't insult my intelligence." The silence that followed was crushing. Clarissa's hands curled into fists beneath the table, but she didn't dare speak. Eleanor let the silence linger, then leaned back in her chair. "My husband didn't report you," she said after a moment. "Do you know why?" Clarissa shook her head. Eleanor's gaze flickered toward the door. "Because he doesn't need to. People like you expose yourselves." Clarissa's stomach twisted. Eleanor continued, her voice softer now, but no less powerful. "I built this airline from the ground up. I know every policy, every protocol, every rule you tried to hide behind today. And I know the difference between an honest mistake and a choice." The weight of those words pressed against Clarissa's chest. She wanted to argue. She wanted to say that it hadn't been personal, that she hadn't meant to cross a line, but deep down she knew that wasn't true. She had made a choice. She had looked at Edric Holt and assumed, and now she was paying the price. The silver-haired executive finally spoke again, his voice carrying the finality of a sealed fate. "As of now, you are officially suspended pending further review. You will be escorted out of the airport immediately. Your access to all airline facilities has been revoked." Clarissa's breath hitched. "Suspended?" Eleanor Holt's expression didn't change. "You should consider yourself lucky it isn't immediate termination." Clarissa wanted to protest, to cling to some last shred of control, but there was nothing left. Nothing she could say would change what had happened. The silver-haired executive stood, signaling that the conversation was over. "A formal letter will be sent to you with further details. Security will escort you out." Clarissa's fingers trembled as she pushed herself to her feet. She had walked through this airport 1,000 times before, her uniform crisp, her head high, her authority unquestioned. But now she was just another former employee, being escorted out like a problem that had been solved. She turned toward the door, her movements stiff and robotic. The two security officers who had brought her here were already waiting. Before she stepped out, Eleanor Holt spoke one last time. "One more thing, Ms. Vaughn." Clarissa stopped, barely turning her head. Eleanor's gaze was piercing. "If you ever get the opportunity to work in this industry again, I suggest you remember this moment." Clarissa said nothing. She walked out of the room, past the executives, past the lounge filled with people who hadn't even noticed her downfall. And as she stepped into the bright airport terminal, she realized something chilling. She had spent years shaping how passengers were treated. Now she was the one being watched, judged, and discarded, and there was absolutely nothing she could do about it. Clarissa Vaughn walked through the terminal in a daze, every step feeling heavier than the last. She had been removed from flights before, but never like this. Never with security walking at her sides. Never with her uniform feeling like a weight rather than a badge of authority. The whispers started almost immediately. Passengers passing by, some recognizing her from the flight, others simply noticing the unusual sight of a flight attendant being escorted out instead of leading the way. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was there. A ripple of curiosity, a handful of quick glances, people turning their heads just slightly to murmur something to the person walking beside them. She knew this feeling, the feeling of being judged before you even spoke. And now, for the first time, she was on the receiving end of it. A gate agent near the boarding desk stiffened as Clarissa passed. She must have already heard. Word spread fast in the airline world. The security officers flanking her remained silent, professional, treating her like a problem they had been assigned to remove. Clarissa clenched her jaw. She had been the one in control for so long, the one people listened to, the one who set the tone on every flight she worked. Now, she was a cautionary tale. The automatic doors leading out of the airport slid open, the rush of city air hitting her face like a slap. Everything felt different. The airport she had once walked through with pride and confidence now felt foreign, like she had been erased from it. A black luxury car sat parked near the curb, the back door open, waiting for someone, and then she saw him, Edric Holt. He stood beside the car, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable as he watched her approach. His presence alone was enough to stop her in her tracks. Clarissa's breath hitched. She had expected never to see him again, had expected him to be done with her the moment she stepped off that plane. But he had stayed, waiting. The security officers gave her a brief nod before stepping back, their job completed. She was no longer their problem. For the first time since this all started, Clarissa was completely alone. Edric studied her, the way she held herself, the way her hands twitched slightly at her sides. He saw everything. Finally, he spoke. "You still don't get it, do you?" Clarissa swallowed hard, her voice catching. He shook his head, his gaze sharp, but there was no anger in it, no satisfaction, just understanding. "You weren't wrong because you searched my bag," he continued. "You weren't wrong because you questioned me. You were wrong because you already had the answer before I ever opened my mouth." Clarissa looked away, shame burning at the edges of her mind. Edric exhaled, shifting his weight slightly. "You've been given authority for so long that you forgot what it feels like to be on the other side of it. And now that you're here, you don't know what to do with yourself." Clarissa clenched her fists. I didn't mean..." "Didn't mean what?" Edric asked, tilting his head. "Didn't mean to get caught? Didn't mean for it to spiral this far? Or didn't mean to assume I didn't belong?" The words cut deeper than she expected, because she knew the answer. Edric studied her a moment longer before shaking his head. "You've got a choice, Ms. Vaughn. You can walk away from this pretending you were just unlucky, that you were treated unfairly. Or..." He let the word hang for a second, then continued. "Or you can take a real look at yourself and ask why it happened in the first place." Clarissa wanted to fight back, wanted to say something sharp, something defensive, something that put her back in control. But there was nothing left, no rules to enforce, no policies to hide behind, no power to lean on. For the first time in her career, she was simply a person standing in front of someone she had wronged, and there was nowhere to run. She swallowed hard. "What if I do take a real look at myself?" Edric gave a small, knowing nod. "Then maybe, just maybe, you'll make sure this never happens again." Silence stretched between them. Then without another word, Edric turned, stepping into the waiting car. Clarissa watched as the door shut behind him, the sleek black vehicle pulling away from the curb, disappearing into the city. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For the first time since stepping onto that plane, she felt small. Not because she had lost her job, not because she had been humiliated, but because she finally understood. This had never been about Edric Holt. This had been about her, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure who she really was. Clarissa Vaughn stood frozen on the curb long after the black car had disappeared into the city. The sound of honking taxis and the distant hum of jet engines filled the air, but it all felt distant, as if she was no longer a part of the world she once controlled. She had spent years in airports, walking through terminals with purpose, her uniform a symbol of authority. But now, stripped of everything, she wasn't sure where to go. Passengers and crew members she once worked alongside passed her without acknowledgement. She wasn't one of them anymore. She wasn't anything. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to move, stepping away from the curb and walking toward the nearest bench. She needed a moment to think, but thinking was dangerous, because when she did, all she could hear was Edric Holt's voice. "You already had the answer before I ever opened my mouth. You weren't wrong because you searched my bag. You were wrong because you assumed I didn't belong." Clarissa squeezed her eyes shut. She wanted to forget. She wanted to push it away, pretend that this was just another bad day, something to move past. But deep down, she knew better. This wasn't just a bad day. This was the moment everything she believed about herself cracked. She had spent her entire career thinking she was right, thinking that her judgment, her instincts, her authority were unquestionable. And now, sitting on a cold metal bench outside an airport she might never work at again, she had to ask herself the question she had been avoiding all along. What if she had always been wrong? The thought sent a wave of nausea rolling through her. She leaned forward, pressing her elbows against her knees, her fingers tangling into her hair. She had worked so hard to get where she was, had sacrificed so much to climb the ranks, to be respected in an industry that didn't give second chances. She had told herself that being tough, being strict, being in control was the only way to survive. But what had it gotten her? She had thought she was strong, but what kind of strength needed to push people down just to hold on? The answer hit her harder than she expected. She had never been strong. She had been afraid. Afraid of losing control. Afraid of being questioned. Afraid that if she didn't enforce authority at all times, people would see right through her. And now they had. She let out a slow, unsteady breath. Across the street, a digital billboard played an airline advertisement. Smiling flight attendants, happy passengers, a world of endless destinations. Clarissa had once been a part of that world. Now she didn't know if she ever would be again. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone. She needed to know. With hesitant fingers, she typed Edric Holt into the search bar. The results loaded instantly. Brigadier General Edric Holt, a decorated war hero, a man who had led missions in combat zones, had spoken at military events, had been featured in interviews about leadership and resilience. And then, another headline. Eleanor Holt and Brigadier General Edric Holt, the power couple behind one of the world's leading airlines. Clarissa stared at the screen, her pulse hammering. She had disrespected a man who had built a legacy, a man who had more experience, more history, more worth than she had ever bothered to consider, and she had done it simply because she thought she could. A lump formed in her throat, thick and unforgiving. Her fingers hovered over the phone screen. What was she even looking for? An excuse? A reason to justify her actions? Some hidden scandal that would make her feel less guilty? There was nothing, because the truth was already in front of her. She had spent so much time seeing herself as the authority, the one who made the rules. But now she had to face the one thing she had never considered before. She had been the problem. She let the phone drop into her lap, staring out at the busy street. She had lost her job. Her reputation was ruined. And yet, for the first time, she wasn't angry at anyone but herself. Because Edric Holt hadn't needed to punish her. He had simply let her walk straight into the consequences of her own choices. Clarissa sat on the bench outside the airport, the sounds of the world moving around her. But she felt like she wasn't a part of it anymore. Everything that had defined her, her uniform, her title, her authority, had been stripped away. She had spent years believing she was in control, that she was the one who decided who belonged where, who was right and who was wrong. But today had shattered that illusion. She had spent so much time convincing herself that she had acted in the best interest of the airline, following protocol, enforcing security. But none of that had been true. She had seen Edric Holt, made up her mind about him before he even spoke, and everything she did after that was just her justifying what she had already decided. And now she was here, not inside the airport, not in the sky, walking the aisles with the power of a uniform, but outside on the fringes of the very world she used to control. A cool gust of wind brushed against her face, carrying the scent of jet fuel and exhaust from the line of taxis waiting at the curb. A group of flight attendants in fresh uniforms walked past, their conversations light, their postures confident. They barely glanced at her. A few hours ago, she had been one of them. Now she was invisible. Her phone vibrated in her lap, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced down at the screen. A message from an unknown number. She hesitated before opening it. Your final evaluation meeting is scheduled for tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. arrival on time. Clarissa exhaled sharply. Final evaluation. That was corporate speak for one last chance to defend herself before they made their decision official. But what was there left to say? Would she argue that she hadn't meant to disrespect Edric Holt? That she had been acting in the best interest of the airline? That it had all been a misunderstanding? Because the truth was, none of that would be true. And even if she did manage to convince them to let her keep her job, What would be left of her reputation? The other flight attendants had seen what happened. The passengers had witnessed everything. She would never have authority again. She let the phone drop back into her lap and leaned forward, pressing her hands together. It would be easy to walk into that meeting and play the victim, to cry about how unfair this was, how she had been singled out and punished too harshly. But deep down, she knew the real reason she was here. This wasn't about one mistake. This was about a pattern. How many times had she questioned passengers who didn't look like they belonged in first class? How many times had she treated people differently because of an assumption she had made the moment they stepped onto the plane? And how many times had she gotten away with it simply because no one had called her out before? A cold realization settled in her chest. Maybe this was the first time she was facing the consequences. But it wasn't the first time she had been wrong. She thought back to Edric Holt's final words to her. "You've got a choice, Ms. Vaughn. You can walk away from this pretending you were just unlucky, that you were treated unfairly, or you can take a real look at yourself and ask why it happened in the first place." Clarissa closed her eyes. She didn't know if she had the courage to ask herself that question, because if she did, she wasn't sure she would like the answer. The street in front of her was alive with motion. People rushing to catch flights, taxi drivers waving at customers, families hugging goodbye. The world was still moving forward, even without her in it. For so long, she had thought that being in control meant never being questioned, never being wrong. But now, for the first time, she wondered if real control wasn't about holding power over others. Maybe it was about having the power to change. Maybe the real question wasn't what would happen to her job. Maybe the real question was who she would be if she lost it. Clarissa sat there for what felt like hours, watching the world move around her. She had spent her entire career telling herself she was in control, that she had earned her position, that her judgment was what kept order in the skies. But now, as she sat outside the airport she had once ruled, she finally realized the truth. She had been living in an illusion. Control had never been about power. It had been about perception. The way she had seen herself, the way she had assumed others saw her. She had believed she was respected because she was strict, because she didn't bend, because she didn't allow mistakes. But what she had really been was afraid. Afraid of being questioned, afraid of admitting that her authority wasn't always justified, afraid that if she didn't hold on to power with an iron grip, someone would take it away from her. And in the end, she had been right. The airline had stripped it from her, not because of some single, terrible mistake, but because she had let herself believe she was untouchable. And now she was nothing. Her phone buzzed again, another reminder of the meeting she had tomorrow morning. One last chance to fight for her job. But for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted it. Clarissa exhaled, standing up from the bench, her legs stiff from sitting for so long. If she had any hope of saving her career, she had to think. She had to prepare. She pulled out her phone and searched for Eleanor Holt's office address. A few seconds later, the result appeared. Clarissa hesitated. She had already made a fool of herself once today. She had already lost almost everything. What good would it do to push any further? But then she thought about what Edric had said. "You've got a choice, Ms. Vaughn. You can pretend this was unfair, or you can take a real look at yourself." For years, Clarissa had dictated who deserved what. Now, for the first time, she had to prove she deserved something herself. And she knew one thing. If she was going to face Eleanor Holt tomorrow, she needed to be ready. The next morning, Clarissa arrived at the airline's executive office an hour before her scheduled meeting. She sat in the lobby, her hands resting in her lap, her fingers curled into the fabric of her skirt. Executives walked in and out, their conversations quiet but purposeful. None of them paid her any attention. They didn't know who she was, and she doubted they cared. That was a strange feeling. For years, she had walked through airports with the certainty that people saw her, noticed her, respected her. But now she was just another name on a suspension list. A receptionist finally called her name. "Ms. Vaughn, Mrs. Holt will see you now." Clarissa stood, smoothing her uniform out of habit before realizing it wasn't her uniform anymore. She had worn a simple blouse and skirt, businesslike but unremarkable. She had no title now, no authority to back her up. Just herself. She followed the receptionist down a long hallway until they reached a large office. The door was already open. Eleanor Holt sat behind a sleek mahogany desk, her posture effortlessly poised, her sharp gaze scanning over a document. She didn't look up immediately. "Sit," she said. Clarissa obeyed, lowering herself into the chair across from her. For the first time in years, she felt small. Eleanor finally set the document aside, folding her hands together. "You're here to convince me to reinstate you." Clarissa swallowed. "I—" Before you say anything, Eleanor interrupted, tilting her head slightly. "Answer one question for me." Clarissa sat up straighter. "Of course." Eleanor's gaze locked onto hers, sharp as a knife. "Why do you want this job back?" Clarissa opened her mouth, but no words came out. She had rehearsed every excuse, every defense, every way she could argue that she deserved another chance. But the moment Eleanor asked that question, she realized something horrifying. She didn't have an answer. For years, she had seen her job as proof of her importance, proof that she was respected, that she was needed. But had she ever really cared about the job itself? Had she cared about the passengers, about making sure they had a good flight? Or had she just cared about making sure they knew she was in charge? Eleanor watched her waiting. Clarissa took a slow breath. And then, for the first time in her life, she told the truth. "I don't know," she admitted. Eleanor didn't look surprised. Clarissa swallowed hard. "I thought I wanted this job because I worked hard for it, because I earned it. But if I was willing to throw passengers off a flight just because I assumed something about them, then maybe I never earned it at all." Eleanor leaned back slightly, her lips pressing together. "That's the first honest thing you've said." Clarissa's chest tightened. "I don't expect you to give me my job back. I just—" She exhaled. "I don't want to leave this meeting pretending I was the victim." Eleanor studied her for a long moment. Then she reached for a document on her desk and slid it forward. Clarissa's heart pounded. Was this her termination letter? A final statement saying she was done forever? But when she looked down, her breath caught. It wasn't a termination notice. It was an offer. Reassignment. Clarissa blinked. "I don't understand." Eleanor steepled her fingers together. "You were an excellent flight attendant, by technical standards. You knew the rules, you enforced them, you maintained order, but you didn't understand the responsibility that comes with that authority." Clarissa hesitated. "And now, Eleanor said, "I think you might." Clarissa glanced at the paper again. It wasn't a reinstatement to her old position. It was a demotion, a ground crew position. "You want me working the gates?" Clarissa asked, her voice almost hollow. Eleanor nodded. "If you accept it." Clarissa's fingers tightened around the edge of the paper. "And if I don't?" Eleanor gave a small, knowing smile. "Then you walk away, and you go back to being the person you were before this." Clarissa didn't speak for a long moment. Then slowly she picked up the pen. She had spent years holding on to control, believing that power meant never admitting weakness. But maybe real power was knowing when to start over. She signed her name. Eleanor took the paper, nodded once, then stood. "You start Monday. Don't make me regret this." Clarissa stood as well, giving a short nod. She had lost everything, but maybe, just maybe, she had found something better. As she stepped out of the office and walked into the busy airport, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not power, not control, but the chance to finally be better than she was before. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more.